The Game of Thrones universe is filled with legendary characters who shaped the fate of Westeros. Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, Tyrion Lannister. But what about the characters who were hyped up only to do absolutely nothing? The ones who were introduced with fanfare, then disappeared without a trace. Today, I'm breaking down the 8 most insignificant characters in Game of Thrones. The forgotten faces who were built up to be important, but ended up being completely useless to the story. And trust me, number 4 will make you question whether the writers had any plan at all for this series. Game of Thrones gave us some of television's most iconic characters, but for every Arya Stark or Tywin Lannister, there were characters who seemed positioned for greatness only to fade into obscurity. These weren't just background extras. These were characters with names, backstories, and seemingly important roles to play. In this video, I'll explain the 8 most insignificant characters from Game of Thrones. People who were introduced with purpose but ultimately contributed nothing to the story. I've analyzed all 8 seasons to find the characters who were the biggest wastes of screen time, and I'll break down exactly why they failed to matter in the grand scheme of things. So let's dive into the most pointless characters in the Game of Thrones universe. Rickon Stark, the Forgotten Wolf. Rickon Stark was the youngest of Ned Stark's children, and in a story where family lineage and heirs are everything, you'd think the last true-born son of House Stark would matter. You'd be wrong. In the books, Rickon is sent to the island of Skagos with his direwolf Shaggy Dog and Osha for protection. There are hints that he's developing into a wild, fierce child who might eventually return to reclaim his birthright. The show, they just forgot about him for 3 seasons. When he finally reappears in Season 6, it's only to die in the most predictable way possible, running in a straight line away from Ramsay Bolton's arrows. No dialogue, no character development, just a plot device to get Jon Snow to attack the Bolton army prematurely. What makes Rickon truly insignificant is that after his death, he's barely mentioned again. His own sisters hardly acknowledge him. By Season 8, it's like he never existed. The last male heir of Winterfell, and his legacy amounts to nothing more than that kid who couldn't zigzag. The worst part? The direwolves were supposed to reflect their Stark counterparts. Shaggy Dog's name literally foreshadowed Rickon's fate. A Shaggy Dog story is a long-winded tale that ultimately goes nowhere and has no point. At least the writers were honest about that one. Quaithe, the masked prophet of nothing. Remember Quaithe, the mysterious masked woman from Qarth who appears to Daenerys in Season 2? No? I don't blame you. In the show, she shows up, makes a few cryptic statements about Daenerys needing to go east to go west and other fortune cookie wisdom, then vanishes forever. That's it. Her entire contribution to the plot. In the books, Quaithe is a recurring character who continues to appear to Daenerys, offering prophecies and warnings that actually guide her decisions. She warns Dany about the Pale Mare, a plague, the perfumed seneschal, and other threats that become major plot points. The show introduced her with all the mystique and build-up of an important character, complete with a distinctive mask and enigmatic dialogue. Then, they just forgot about her. No resolution, no payoff, no explanation of who she was or what she wanted. Quaithe represents everything wrong with how Game of Thrones handled its magical elements, introducing them with fanfare, then abandoning them when the writers couldn't figure out what to do with them. She's the embodiment of wasted potential. Edmure Tully, the perpetual punchline. Poor Edmure Tully. The Lord of Riverrun and brother of Catelyn Stark should have been a major player in the Game of Thrones. Instead, he became the show's favorite punching bag. Let's review Edmure's contributions to the story. He missed his father's funeral boat with an arrow, played for laughs, got tricked by Robb into attacking the wrong castle, got married at the Red Wedding, which didn't go well, spent years as a prisoner, and then was told to sit down and shut up by his niece Sansa in the series finale. In the books, Edmure is flawed but not incompetent. He's a decent lord who cares about his people, even opening Riverrun to commoners during wartime. The show transformed him into a bumbling idiot whose only purpose was to be humiliated for comic relief. What makes Edmure truly insignificant is that despite being the rightful lord of the Riverlands, one of the 7 kingdoms, he has zero impact on the story's outcome. He doesn't affect any major character's decisions, doesn't contribute to any battles, and doesn't influence the political landscape in any meaningful way. His final appearance in the series finale, where he starts to suggest himself as king only to be mockingly shut down by Sansa, perfectly encapsulates his role, a character who exists solely to be reminded of his own insignificance. The Night King, the greatest threat that wasn't. Yes, I'm putting the Night King on this list, and no, I'm not joking. Hear me out. For 7 seasons, the Night King was built up as the ultimate threat to Westeros. Winter is coming was the tagline of the entire show. Jon Snow spent season after season warning everyone about the apocalyptic threat beyond the Wall. The very first scene of the entire series showed the White Walkers. And what was the payoff? The Night King dies in his first battle south of the Wall, killed by a leaping Arya Stark in a single episode. No explanation of his motivations beyond, he wants to erase the world's memory. No final confrontation with Jon Snow despite years of buildup. No revelation about the symbols he created or why he wanted Bran specifically. For a character who was supposed to be the embodiment of death itself, the Night King accomplished remarkably little. He killed a dragon, which ultimately didn't matter, knocked down a wall, which only mattered for one episode, and killed some nameless extras at Winterfell. The most insignificant thing about the Night King is that after his death, he's barely mentioned again. The characters immediately pivot to fighting over the Iron Throne, as if the apocalypse they just averted was a minor inconvenience. By the series finale, it's like the army of the dead never existed. For a villain with no dialogue, no clear motivation, and no lasting impact on the story, the Night King might be the most overhyped yet ultimately insignificant character in television history. Daario Naharis, the boyfriend who disappeared. Daario Naharis was introduced as a charismatic sellsword who becomes Daenerys' advisor, bodyguard, and eventually lover. He's handsome, skilled in combat, and completely devoted to his queen. He should have been important. Instead, Daenerys leaves him behind to rule Meereen in Season 6, and he's never mentioned again. Not once. Not even when Daenerys is making decisions about her love life with Jon Snow. Not when she's dying in Jon's arms. Not when her closest advisors are discussing her legacy. The show spent 3 seasons developing his relationship with Daenerys, only to discard him like yesterday's trash. Even Grey Worm, who also stayed behind in Meereen initially, eventually rejoined Daenerys and played a role in the final seasons. Daario just vanished from the narrative. What makes Daario truly insignificant is that his entire character could be removed from the show without affecting the plot in any meaningful way. His military victories could have been attributed to other characters. His romance with Daenerys had no lasting impact on her character development. And his governance of Meereen is never followed up on. For a character who appeared in 22 episodes, Daario Naharis contributed remarkably little to the story of Game of Thrones. Doran Martell, the Prince of Irrelevance. Doran Martell, the Prince of Dorne, was played by acclaimed actor Alexander Siddig and introduced as a calculating, patient player of the Game of Thrones. In the books, he reveals to his daughter that he's been plotting Lannister destruction for years, working secretly to restore the Targaryens to power. In the show, he sits in his wheelchair, gives a speech about patience, and then gets stabbed by his brother's paramour, Ellaria Sand, in his second episode. That's it. The ruler of one of the 7 kingdoms, and his entire contribution to the story is to die quickly to establish how ruthless Ellaria is. What makes Doran truly insignificant is that after his death, Dorne itself becomes irrelevant. Despite being the only kingdom that wasn't depleted by the War of the 5 Kings, Dorne contributes nothing to the final seasons. They don't participate in the battle against the Night King, they barely factor into Daenerys' war against Cersei, and they get a new unnamed prince in the final episode who has no lines. Doran represents the show's complete failure to integrate Dorne into the main story in any meaningful way. An entire kingdom with a unique culture and political stance, reduced to a footnote because the writers couldn't figure out what to do with it after diverging from the books. Kinvara, the High Priestess of Exposition. Kinvara appears in exactly 1 scene in Season 6. She's introduced as a High Priestess of the Lord of Light, more powerful than Melisandre, who declares Daenerys to be the promised one who will defeat the darkness. And then, nothing. She never appears again. Her prophecies are never confirmed or denied. She doesn't help Daenerys in any way. She doesn't interact with Melisandre to create any interesting religious conflict. She doesn't even get mentioned by other characters. What makes Kinvara truly insignificant is that her entire scene could be cut from the show without affecting anything. Her declaration that Daenerys is the chosen one doesn't influence Daenerys' actions or beliefs. The information she provides about the Lord of Light adds nothing new to what we already knew from Melisandre. Kinvara is the definition of a character who exists solely for exposition, introduced only to tell the audience something rather than to actually participate in the story. For a high priestess of a major religion who supposedly wields significant power, her impact on the world of Game of Thrones is precisely 0. Howland Reed, the missing kingmaker. Howland Reed never actually appears in the present timeline of Game of Thrones, except as a young man in Bran's vision, but his absence is so conspicuous that it makes him one of the most insignificant characters by omission. Who is Howland Reed? Only the man who saved Ned Stark's life at the Tower of Joy, The only living person who knew the truth about Jon Snow's parentage from the beginning, the father of Jojen and Mira who helped Bran reach the Three-Eyed Raven, and the Lord of Greywater Watch, a moving castle that can't be found by enemies. In the books, there are constant references to Howland Reed and speculation about when he'll finally appear to reveal crucial information. The show just forgot about him. Even when Jon's parentage becomes the central conflict of the final seasons, Howland Reed is nowhere to be found. What makes Howland truly insignificant is that the show had to create awkward workarounds for his absence. Instead of having Howland confirm Jon's parentage, they use Bran's visions and an extremely convenient diary entry from High Septon Maynard that Sam finds. Howland Reed represents the show's tendency to discard potentially interesting characters when they became inconvenient to the streamlined plot. A character who should have been crucial to the endgame was rendered completely irrelevant. These 8 characters represent the biggest wastes of potential in Game of Thrones. Characters who are introduced with purpose and promise, only to fade into obscurity or die without contributing anything meaningful to the story. What's particularly frustrating is that many of these characters have significant roles in the books that were either abandoned or simplified beyond recognition for the show. It's a testament to how the later seasons of Game of Thrones prioritize spectacle over coherent storytelling. The Night King's anticlimactic end, Rickon's pointless death, Doran's wasted potential, Quaithe's abandoned prophecies, these aren't just disappointing character arcs, they're symptoms of the larger problems that plagued the show's final seasons. As we look forward to future Game of Thrones spin-offs like House of the Dragon, we can only hope that the writers have learned from these mistakes and will give their characters the development and purpose they deserve. If you enjoyed this breakdown of Game of Thrones' most insignificant characters, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which character you think was the biggest waste of potential. This is Explainified, and I'll see you in the next video.